I rented a small Airbnb house for a long weekend because I wanted some quiet. It was a one-bedroom place on the edge of a rural town, set back from the road with a gravel driveway and trees pressing in on both sides. The listing had made it look cozy. Wood floors, a little porch, a tidy kitchen. It felt like the kind of spot where I could just relax, read, and sleep without being bothered. When I arrived, the host gave me simple instructions by message. The key was in a lockbox by the back door. I drove up late in the afternoon, found the house empty, and let myself in. The inside was simple but clean. Basic furniture, a couch with a throw blanket, a small dining table, and the kitchen tucked right beside it. The back door opened straight into that kitchen with a thin rug in front of it. Everything smelled faintly of pine cleaner, and I could tell someone had prepped it recently for guests. I carried my bag into the bedroom, unpacked a little, and went about making the place mine. The first evening was uneventful. I cooked some pasta, scrolled on my phone, and eventually locked up for the night. I remember double-checking the back door. It was an older wood-frame door with a deadbolt and a sliding chain. I tested it twice, then pulled the rug straight before going to bed. The night was quiet. No traffic, no neighbors close enough to hear. The kind of silence that felt heavier than what I was used to in the city. At some point, I drifted into a deep sleep. When I woke the next morning, something felt wrong before I even sat up. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee and froze halfway across the room. There were boot prints on the floor, muddy ones, thick outlines of heavy-soled boots, starting at the back door. They pressed across the thin rug into the tile of the kitchen and stopped directly in front of the refrigerator. The mud was still damp, dark against the pale tiles, smudged in some places where the weight of a heel had dug in. I just stood there staring. My mind couldn't process it at first. I had locked that door. I was alone. There was no reason for those prints to be there. I followed them with my eyes again, straight from the back door to the refrigerator. And then they stopped. No prints leading away. No prints circling the room. Just a trail into the kitchen that ended like whoever left them had vanished in front of the fridge. My skin crawled. I looked at the door. The deadbolt was still in place. The chain was still set. Everything looked exactly as I had left it the night before. But somehow, during the night, someone had come inside. I checked the refrigerator out of instinct, my hand shaking as I pulled it open. Nothing seemed moved inside. Just the bottled water and a few groceries I'd picked up the night before. The shelves looked normal. I shut it quickly, feeling foolish but still unsettled. Then I checked the floor more carefully. The prints were spaced like a person walking normally, not rushing. The size looked like a man's boot, maybe bigger than my own foot. The mud had flecks of leaves and grit in it, the kind of dirt you'd pick up from a wooded path or wet ground. I crouched down, touching the rug by the door. It was damp where the first print had pressed in. It hadn't been like that when I went to bed. I felt this tight pull in my chest. I tried to tell myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe the host had come in earlier to check something before I arrived. But that didn't fit. I had been the one to straighten the rug, and the prints were fresh. Besides, why would anyone come in, walk to the refrigerator, and leave no trail out? I walked the house twice, checking every window, every closet, every corner. Everything was empty. The doors were all locked. Nothing was stolen. My wallet and phone were right where I'd left them. It made no sense. For the rest of that day, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every time I looked at the back door, I pictured someone standing there in the dark, quietly letting themselves in. I scrubbed the prints off the floor because I couldn't stand looking at them, but the sight was burned into my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. I left the light on in the kitchen and sat in bed listening for sounds. The silence was worse now. I kept imagining the soft thud of boots on the tile, the deadbolt sliding back without me touching it. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something faint, like the tiniest creak near the back door. My heart hammered, and I held my breath, staring into the glow of the kitchen. But nothing followed. No prints appeared. The door never opened. By sunrise, I felt drained and restless. I packed up fast, throwing everything into my bag without caring how messy it was. I left the key in the lockbox and drove away without looking back at the house. Later, when I tried to make sense of it, the details only unsettled me more. The back door had been locked, both with the deadbolt and the chain, when I found it in the morning. The prints were inside, not outside, and they had ended at the refrigerator, like the person either stood there for a while or never left through the way they came. I'll never know how it happened. Maybe the door didn't latch right and someone came in during the night. Maybe there was another way into the basement or a crawl space. Maybe the host or someone else with a key thought the place was empty. But none of those explanations sit right when I think about the prints stopping dead in front of the fridge, damp and heavy, with no trail back out. That was enough for me. I decided after that trip I'd never stay in a remote Airbnb alone again, especially not one with an old back door. Because it's one thing to worry about creaks in the night. It's another to wake up and see proof that someone really was inside, standing in the dark while you slept, leaving just enough behind to remind you that locks don't always keep you safe. When I booked the Airbnb, I wanted a quiet place where I could shut off from everything for a few days. The listing looked perfect, small, simple, and tucked away in a rural area. It was described as a guest house on the edge of the owner's property, but private and fully separate, with its own entrance. The photos showed a neat living room with a small couch, a compact kitchen, and a single bedroom. It didn't look like much, but it looked clean and practical. It felt like the kind of place where you could make coffee in the morning, read by the window, and not worry about anyone bothering you. When I arrived, the host was waiting outside. He seemed friendly enough, middle-aged, thin, wearing worn jeans and a baseball cap. He smiled, showed me where to park, and walked me through the place. He pointed out the thermostat, the Wi-Fi password taped to the fridge, the cabinet where the dishes were kept. He seemed talkative, maybe a little too much, but I brushed it off as him being eager to make a good impression. The first couple of hours went fine. I unpacked, put food in the fridge, and sat down on the couch to unwind after the drive. The place was quiet except for the sound of birds outside. I thought I was going to get exactly what I wanted: time alone, space to breathe. But about an hour later, I heard the front door open. No knock, no warning. The host walked right in, holding a pair of gloves in his hand. He smiled and said he had forgotten something. When he was cleaning earlier, he grabbed a broom from the corner and walked back out as if it was nothing. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide if I was overreacting. Maybe he really had forgotten the broom. Maybe it was just an honest mistake. But the way he hadn't even waited for me to answer the door made me uneasy. That night, I tried to put it out of my head. I cooked a simple dinner, watched something on my laptop, and got ready for bed. The place felt a little too quiet, and every creak of the walls put me on edge. I reminded myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, as I was making coffee, I heard the door open again. I turned quickly, and there he was, stepping inside with a set of keys in his hand. This time he said he had left behind a tool he needed. He opened a cabinet near the kitchen sink, rummaged around for a few seconds, and left again. My chest was tight the whole time. I watched him walk out and realized that he had come in without asking, without texting, without even pretending to wait for permission. And now I knew he had a key. The rest of the morning, I couldn't settle down. I kept listening for the sound of the door, expecting him to come back again. I checked every window to make sure they were locked. I even dragged a chair in front of the front door, just to feel like I had some control. By late afternoon, I tried to go for a walk to clear my head. The property stretched out into open fields, and the air was cool. For a little while, I felt better. But when I came back, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. One of my bags had been unzipped. I knew I had left it shut. A sweatshirt that I had folded neatly on top was pushed to the side. It wasn't a big change, but it was enough to tell me someone had been inside while I was gone. That night, I barely slept. I kept my light on, sitting up in bed, staring at the door. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside on the porch, faint but steady. I held my breath, waiting for the handle to turn. After a few minutes, the sound faded, but I didn't relax. Couldn't. The following morning, I decided I'd had enough. I started packing my things, shoving clothes back into my bag. That's when I heard the door again. He walked in holding a flashlight this time, saying he needed to check something in the corner closet. He didn't look surprised to see me standing there, half-packed, heart pounding. He acted casual, moving slowly, like this was normal. I realized then that it wasn't about forgetting things or needing tools. He was coming in to watch, to look around, maybe even to see what I was doing when I thought I was alone. The forgotten items were just an excuse. I didn't say anything. I just stood frozen until he left again. As soon as the door closed, I grabbed the rest of my stuff and loaded it into the car. I didn't care if I was leaving early or losing money. I just wanted out. When I pulled away from the driveway, I glanced back. He was standing at the edge of the porch, watching me go. No wave, no smile this time. Just standing there, hands in his pockets, staring. Back in town, I reported everything to the rental site. I explained that he had come in multiple times without notice, that my things had been moved, that I felt unsafe. They said they'd investigate, but I never heard how it ended. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stayed anywhere that wasn't my own home, I found myself checking locks, scanning corners, leaving bags zipped tight to see if they'd been touched. What unsettled me most wasn't just that he came inside. It was the calm way he did it, as if he had been doing it long before me and would keep doing it long after. The trip was supposed to give me quiet, but instead it showed me something else. That trust in a stranger's property is fragile, and when it's broken, it doesn't leave. The memory of him letting himself in, the sight of him standing on that porch as I left, has stayed sharp in my mind. I knew then that he hadn't forgotten anything at all. He had been coming in because he wanted to see, because he wanted to know. And the thought of how many others he had done it to, how much he might have seen before, is something I will never be able to shake. When I booked the basement Airbnb, I thought I was getting a quiet, private space to myself. The listing showed a clean little setup: queen bed, small couch, kitchenette, and a bathroom tucked off to the side. It was cheaper than most places in the area, and I figured being in a basement meant it would be quiet, cooler, and without much street noise. When I arrived, the host led me down a set of narrow steps along the side of the house. The door opened into the basement unit, and it was just as the pictures showed. Low ceiling, carpet, a few lamps giving it a warm glow. It had that faint, musty smell that all basements have, but nothing unbearable. I brought my bag in and settled quickly. The only thing that struck me as odd was in the bedroom closet. When I slid the door open to hang up my jacket, I saw a second door built into the back wall. It was painted the same color as the rest of the closet, but there was a knob on it, locked tight. I tried it out of habit, but it didn't budge. At the time, I figured it was just access to a utility area, or maybe it led to the host side of the basement. I didn't think much of it, though the sight of a locked door right behind where I'd be sleeping stuck in my mind more than I wanted to admit. That first evening passed quietly. I cooked something small on the hot plate, watched a bit of TV, and scrolled through my phone until I was tired. Before bed, I checked the basement door that led outside and made sure it was locked. I also looked at the closet door again. It bothered me the way it sat there at the back of the closet, like a second entrance I couldn't control. I told myself it was just a door to nowhere important. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark and silent except for the hum of the mini fridge. But then I heard it, a soft, faint sound. The closet handle. It was subtle, like someone testing it quietly. A slow jiggle of the knob, metal brushing against metal. Not loud or violent, just cautious, as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to be heard but also wanted to know if the lock would give. I froze. My whole body stiffened against the mattress, and my ears strained. The sound came again, just a delicate rattle of the handle, then a pause, then another. Whoever it was, they weren't rushing. They were patient, careful. I didn't move a muscle. My phone was inches away on the nightstand, but I was afraid even the glow of the screen would give me away. I just lay there, listening, heart pounding so hard it felt like the mattress vibrated under me. The sound went on for what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse because I didn't know if the person had gone or was still standing right behind that thin door, inches from where I lay. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the closet, waiting for the noise to come back. It never did, and eventually morning light seeped through the small basement window. I barely slept after that. When I got up, I walked straight to the closet. The door looked the same, paint chipped near the knob, no signs of damage or forced entry. But standing there, so close, I could feel how thin the wall between me and the other side really was. If someone had a key or if the lock failed, they could step right into the basement bedroom in seconds. I spent most of that day out, not wanting to sit in the basement wondering. But the thought of it gnawed at me. That door wasn't just some sealed-off utility space. Someone had been on the other side. Someone had tested it while I slept. That night, I didn't feel safe at all. I pushed a chair in front of the closet door, even though I knew it wouldn't really stop anyone. I stacked my bag on top of the chair, so if it moved, I would hear it. I checked the basement door lock 3 times. Lying in bed, I couldn't stop imagining who might have been behind the door. Was it the host checking on me using some hidden passage between the units? Was it someone else living in the house who knew about the locked door? Or worse, was it someone the host didn't even know about? Someone who had a way into the crawl space or storage behind it. Every creak of the building made me jump. At one point in the night, I swore I heard faint movement again, but it was so soft I couldn't be sure if it was real or my own nerves making sounds out of silence. By the time the sun came up again, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I gathered my things, packed up, and left the key in the lockbox without looking back. When I got home, I kept thinking about that door. The listing had never mentioned it. There was no reason for anyone to be behind it at 2 in the morning, no reason for the handle to move. It wasn't some draft or an old house creaking. It was deliberate, controlled, someone testing if they could get inside. I never left a review. I didn't want to stir anything up with the host, didn't want them to have my name fresh in their mind. I just quietly decided I would never again stay in a basement Airbnb, never again sleep with a locked door at my back that I couldn't control. The scariest part wasn't the sound itself. It was knowing that someone was there, just on the other side, reaching for the same handle, separated by a lock I had no way of reinforcing. It made me realize that renting a place, trusting the photos, trusting the host, meant putting yourself in a situation where you didn't really know what walls surrounded you, or who had access to the other side. That night in the basement stuck with me, not because anything happened, but because something almost did. The line between being safe in a locked room and being face-to-face with a stranger in the dark was as thin as that closet door. And someone, for reasons I'll never know, wanted to test it. When I booked the basement Airbnb, I thought I was getting a quiet, private space to myself. The listing showed a clean little setup. Queen bed, small couch, kitchenette, and a bathroom tucked off to the side. It was cheaper than most places in the area, and I figured being in a basement meant it would be quiet, cooler, and without much street noise. When I arrived, the host led me down a set of narrow steps along the side of the house. The door opened into the basement unit, and it was just as the pictures showed. Low ceiling, carpet, a few lamps giving it a warm glow. It had that faint, musty smell that all basements have, but nothing unbearable. I brought my bag in and settled quickly. The only thing that struck me as odd was in the bedroom closet. When I slid the door open to hang up my jacket, I saw a second door built into the back wall. It was painted the same color as the rest of the closet, but there was a knob on it, locked tight. I tried it out of habit, but it didn't budge. At the time, I figured it was just access to a utility area, or maybe it led to the host side of the basement. I didn't think much of it, though the sight of a locked door right behind where I'd be sleeping stuck in my mind more than I wanted to admit. That first evening passed quietly. I cooked something small on the hot plate, watched a bit of TV, and scrolled through my phone until I was tired. Before bed, I checked the basement door that led outside and made sure it was locked. I also looked at the closet door again. It bothered me the way it sat there at the back of the closet, like a second entrance I couldn't control. I told myself it was just a door to nowhere important. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, The room was dark and silent except for the hum of the mini fridge. But then I heard it. A soft, faint sound. The closet handle. It was subtle, like someone testing it quietly. A slow jiggle of the knob, metal brushing against metal. Not loud or violent, just cautious, as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to be heard but also wanted to know if the lock would give. I froze. My whole body stiffened against the mattress, and my ears strained. The sound came again, just a delicate rattle of the handle, then a pause, then another. Whoever it was, they weren't rushing. They were patient, careful. I didn't move a muscle. My phone was inches away on the nightstand, but I was afraid even the glow of the screen would give me away. I just lay there, listening, heart pounding so hard it felt like the mattress vibrated under me. The sound went on for what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse because I didn't know if the person had gone or was still standing right behind that thin door, inches from where I lay. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the closet, waiting for the noise to come back. It never did, and eventually morning light seeped through the small basement window. I barely slept after that. When I got up, I walked straight to the closet. The door looked the same, paint chipped near the knob, no signs of damage or forced entry. But standing there, so close, I could feel how thin the wall between me and the other side really was. If someone had a key or if the lock failed, they could step right into the basement bedroom in seconds. I spent most of that day out, not wanting to sit in the basement wondering. But the thought of it gnawed at me. That door wasn't just some sealed-off utility space. Someone had been on the other side. Someone had tested it while I slept. That night, I didn't feel safe at all. I pushed a chair in front of the closet door, even though I knew it wouldn't really stop anyone. I stacked my bag on top of the chair, so if it moved, I would hear it. I checked the basement door lock 3 times. Lying in bed, I couldn't stop imagining who might have been behind the door. Was it the host checking on me using some hidden passage between the units? Was it someone else living in the house who knew about the locked door? Or worse, was it someone the host didn't even know about? Someone who had a way into the crawl space or storage behind it? Every creak of the building made me jump. At one point in the night, I swore I heard faint movement again, but it was so soft I couldn't be sure if it was real or my own nerves making sounds out of silence. By the time the sun came up again, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I gathered my things, packed up, and left the key in the lockbox without looking back. When I got home, I kept thinking about that door. The listing had never mentioned it. There was no reason for anyone to be behind it at 2 a.m, no reason for the handle to move. It wasn't some draft or an old house creaking. It was deliberate, controlled, someone testing if they could get inside. I never left a review. I didn't want to stir anything up with the host, didn't want them to have my name fresh in their mind. I just quietly decided I would never again stay in a basement Airbnb, never again sleep with a locked door at my back that I couldn't control. The scariest part wasn't the sound itself. It was knowing that someone was there, just on the other side, reaching for the same handle, separated by a lock I had no way of reinforcing. It made me realize that renting a place, trusting the photos, trusting the host, meant putting yourself in a situation where you didn't really know what walls surrounded you, or who had access to the other side. That night in the basement stuck with me, not because anything happened, but because something almost did. The line between being safe in a locked room and being face-to-face with a stranger in the dark was as thin as that closet door. And someone, for reasons I'll never know, wanted to test it. I booked the cabin because it was supposed to be quiet, private, and far from the usual noise of cities and crowded hotels. My partner and I had been feeling worn down, and the idea of spending a long weekend in the woods with no interruptions sounded like exactly what we needed. The listing had described it as a cozy, secluded cabin with modern touches, surrounded by trees, a small gravel driveway, and nothing but nature around. The photos looked warm, simple, and inviting. Wooden walls, a small fireplace, soft rugs on the floors, and large windows looking out over the forest. It seemed like the kind of place where you could leave the world behind for a while. When we pulled into the driveway, I remember the way the tires crunched on the gravel. The place looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. The trees stood tall all around it, their branches weaving into each other, forming a sort of natural wall that made the cabin feel tucked away and hidden from the rest of the world. It gave me the first sense of peace I'd had in weeks. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and fresh wood. The interior was neat, clean, and staged perfectly for people like us looking for comfort in the wilderness. A thick blanket lay folded at the end of the couch. A basket of firewood sat beside the fireplace, and there was a little welcome note on the counter. Everything seemed right. We unpacked slowly, leaving our bags by the bedroom door while we explored. The cabin wasn't large, just one bedroom, a bathroom, a small kitchen, and the main living room with the fireplace. The walls were lined with shelves that had a few books and board games. The furniture was simple and sturdy, and the lighting came from soft, warm bulbs in lamps and overhead fixtures. I noticed how the cabin felt staged. Not messy like a place that someone lived in full-time, but carefully arranged for guests. Still, that was normal for a rental, and I didn't think much of it. That first night, after dinner, we sat on the couch with the fire going and listened to the woods outside. The air was cool, and through the windows you could see the dark outlines of the trees swaying in the breeze. It was quiet in a way that felt almost heavy, like the silence itself pressed in against the glass. I remember lying in bed later, the blankets pulled tight around me, and thinking how rare it was to hear absolutely nothing. No cars, no voices, no hum of appliances. Just the occasional crack of wood cooling in the fireplace and the whisper of the wind. The next morning, while making coffee, I glanced up at the smoke detector above the kitchen doorway. Caught my attention only because it looked newer than the rest of the cabin. The plastic was bright white, while everything else, the lamps, the ceiling fan, even the outlets, looked a little older, worn from use. Struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe the owner had replaced it recently, which made sense since fire safety was important in a wooden cabin. Later, when I was lying on the couch scrolling through my phone, my eyes landed on a picture frame above the fireplace. It was a simple landscape photograph, a field with mountains in the distance. But the glass in the frame reflected oddly, almost like it was thicker than normal. I leaned forward, looking closer. At the bottom corner of the frame, barely visible, was a tiny dot that didn't belong. It was small enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you were staring directly at it. My stomach tightened. I stood there, staring, trying to convince myself it was just a quirk of the glass. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became. It looked like a lens. I didn't say anything right away. I walked slowly around the living room, scanning the walls, the corners, the shelves. That's when I noticed another one, in a clock on the opposite wall. The center of the clock's face had the same kind of tiny black dot, something you wouldn't give a second thought to unless you were searching for it. My chest felt tight, my skin prickling. I started looking harder. The smoke detector in the bedroom ceiling, another in the hallway, the picture frame above the bed. All of them had the same small, dark eye staring out. Once I saw the first, I couldn't unsee the rest. They were everywhere. The realization sank in slowly but heavily. We had been here since the night before. We had changed clothes, slept, moved around freely, believing we were in private. Every moment, every action could have been recorded. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I stood in the middle of the living room, scanning each object with suspicion. I could almost feel the weight of invisible eyes on me. The peace and quiet of the cabin suddenly felt wrong, like it had all been arranged to lure us in and keep us comfortable while we were watched. I unplugged every lamp and turned over the smoke detectors I could reach, confirming what I already suspected. Each had a small camera lens hidden inside. They weren't just random objects with unusual details, they were active, functional devices. Whoever owned the cabin had gone out of their way to install them in places where people wouldn't notice. Panic rushed through me, and I knew we couldn't stay another minute. I grabbed our bags from the bedroom and tossed them into the car while my partner gathered the rest of our things. Every second inside that cabin felt unbearable, like the walls themselves were closing in with unseen eyes. I didn't even bother locking the door when we left. I just needed to get away. Driving down the narrow gravel road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to follow us. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the thought of all the footage that must already exist. We had been there for hours, maybe a full day, and whoever set up those cameras had likely been watching in real time. When we got back to town, we went straight to the police. I explained everything in detail, describing the locations of the cameras, the strange feeling when I first noticed them, the way they were disguised inside everyday objects. They took my statement seriously, but I could see in their faces that this wasn't the first time they had heard of something like this. Hidden cameras in rentals weren't common, but they weren't unheard of either. I thought that reporting it would bring some kind of closure, but it didn't. Even after leaving, even after telling the police, I couldn't shake the feeling that pieces of our lives had been taken from us. Private moments, gestures, routines, things that belonged to us alone, were now stored somewhere we couldn't control. The worst part wasn't even knowing we'd been watched. The worst part was realizing how normal the cabin had seemed, how comfortable I had felt when we first arrived. It looked safe, quiet, and perfect. And underneath all that, it was a trap. That weekend didn't fade like most trips do. It stayed sharp in my mind. Now, whenever I stay anywhere new, whether it's a rental or a hotel, I scan the room carefully. I look at smoke detectors, picture frames, clocks, outlets, anything that seems slightly out of place. That cabin taught me that privacy can vanish without you realizing it, that the safety you feel in certain spaces can be nothing more than a trick. The ending of that trip wasn't about rest or peace or memories made in the woods. It was about driving away in silence, knowing we'd been seen in ways no one should ever be seen. It was about leaving behind the idea that a locked door and four walls meant we were safe. From that point on, I understood that sometimes the scariest things aren't out in the dark woods around the cabin. They're inside, watching you the whole time, hidden in plain sight. When I first saw the cabin listed, it looked perfect. It was small, tucked away in the woods, and had that warm look that makes you imagine sitting by the fire with a blanket. I booked it without much hesitation. The listing had good reviews, and the photos showed a clean living room with a stone fireplace, a little kitchen with wooden counters, and a single bedroom. It seemed simple and private, exactly the kind of place I wanted to spend a few nights away from everything. When we arrived, the driveway wound through tall trees, and the tires cracked twigs under the car as we pulled up. The cabin looked like the photos, dark wood siding, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs, and a single light above the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and something musty, like a place that wasn't lived in full time but kept just clean enough for guests. I walked through each room, setting my bags down and checking the space. The living room was cozy, with a couch and a rug that looked new. The kitchen was stocked with just enough dishes and utensils to get by. The bedroom had a queen bed pushed against the wall, a dresser, and one window looking out into the woods. Everything was quiet, and at first it seemed like we'd found a perfect spot. But when I walked down the short hallway between the kitchen and the bedroom, I noticed something that wasn't in the photos. On the left side of the hall, there was a door. It wasn't like the others. It was heavier, older, and most noticeably, it had a thick bolt fixed across it at the top. The kind of bolt you'd use to keep something firmly shut. The door itself was plain, painted the same color as the wall, but the hardware was newer, shiny against the dull surface. At first, I assumed it was a utility closet or maybe a storage space where the owner kept supplies. It didn't seem unusual for a rental to have one locked door where guests weren't supposed to go. Still, something about the way it was bolted from our side struck me as odd. Usually, a landlord would lock it from the inside if they didn't want guests inside. But this one was sealed in a way that looked more like it was meant to keep whatever was behind it from getting out. I shrugged it off. I didn't want to start the trip overthinking small things. We unpacked, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. The woods outside grew dark quickly, and by the time I stepped onto the porch to take in the cool air, the trees were just black shapes, swaying slightly in the breeze. There was no sound of traffic, no voices, just insects buzzing and the occasional snap of a branch falling somewhere in the forest. Later, as we lay in bed, the silence pressed in thick around us. The cabin creaked lightly as it cooled, would adjusting to the night air. I was drifting towards sleep when I heard something faint. It wasn't outside. It was inside, and it came from the hallway. At first, it was just a light scrape like wood against wood. Then it came again, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the bolted door. I held still, trying to figure out if it was my imagination. The sound grew more distinct, slow, steady movements, something shifting behind that door. My chest tightened, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise. It wasn't the settling of the cabin. It was deliberate. The sound of weight shifting across a floor, something brushing lightly against wood. Then a soft thud, like a footstep. I lay there, frozen, listening. My breathing felt too loud, like it might give me away even though I wasn't the one being watched. The movements continued, slow, spaced out, as if someone or something was pacing on the other side of that door. I tried to tell myself it could be an animal. Maybe there was a crawl space or some kind of access behind the door where a raccoon had gotten in. But the heaviness of the steps didn't match that. It sounded heavier, more human. The thought made my stomach twist. I couldn't shake the image of that bolt across the door. The fact that it was on our side suddenly felt more important. Whoever had put it there had done so to keep whatever was inside from coming out. The noises lasted for what felt like hours. At times they grew faint, then picked up again, always in the same spot, always behind that door. I didn't move. I just lay still, waiting, my ears straining for every sound. Eventually, the movements quieted, fading into silence. I must have drifted into an uneasy sleep sometime before dawn. When I woke, light was spilling through the curtains. The cabin looked normal again, but I couldn't forget the night. My first instinct was to check the hallway. The bolted door was still shut, the hardware untouched. But when I crouched down, I noticed something new. A thin line of dust disturbed along the bottom edge of the door, like something had been moving close to it from the inside. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept glancing down that hallway, half expecting the bolt to slide loose on its own. I thought about leaving early, but part of me didn't want to admit how much it rattled me. I kept trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. That night, it started again. The moment the cabin grew quiet, the noises came back. Shuffling, slow movement, sometimes pausing for long stretches before starting again. I lay in bed with my eyes open, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling while every sound dug deeper into me. I could hear the faint rhythm of steps, the creak of wood, sometimes even the sound of breathing when everything else went still. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. We packed quickly and left, not bothering to clean up or linger. As I locked the cabin behind me, I looked one last time down the hallway. The door was still bolted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing on the other side, listening. Back in town, I reported it to the rental site. I explained about the bolted door, the noises, everything I'd heard. They thanked me, said they'd look into it, but I never heard back about what they found. What stuck with me most wasn't just the noise. It was the way the door was bolted from our side. Someone knew there was something inside that room. They had chosen not to tell anyone renting the place. They just left it sealed up, hoping guests wouldn't notice or wouldn't ask questions. To this day, I wonder what was really behind that door. Maybe it was storage, maybe an animal, or maybe something worse. I'll never know. What I do know is that I will never again stay in a place where I don't understand every corner, every room, and every locked door. Because that cabin taught me that sometimes the scariest part of a place isn't what you see. It's what someone decided to keep hidden just a few feet away, behind a thin wall and a bolt meant to hold it back. When we booked the cabin, it seemed like a perfect getaway. It was listed as remote, quiet, surrounded by forest, and far enough from any main roads that we could feel away from everything. The pictures showed a log cabin with a small porch, a fire pit outside, and a cozy living room with a fireplace. The listing mentioned Wi-Fi and said the cabin had everything needed for a comfortable stay. That mattered because even though we wanted peace, we still wanted to check in with family and have some way to connect if we needed to. We drove for hours to get there. The last stretch was down a gravel road lined with trees that grew so thick they formed a kind of tunnel overhead. When the GPS told us we had arrived, the cabin appeared between the trees, just as it looked in the pictures. The wood siding was dark, the roof steep, and there was a single light by the front door. It looked inviting in that way that remote cabins do, like it was made to give you shelter from everything outside. Inside, the air was cool, faintly smelling of pine and dust. We dropped our bags and walked through the rooms. There was one main room with a couch, a small dining table, and the fireplace. The kitchen was tucked to the side with a few shelves of dishes and pots. The bedrooms were small, with simple beds covered in quilts. It felt basic but fine, like the kind of place where you didn't need much more than food and warmth. The first thing I noticed was my phone had no signal. I held it up, walked around the cabin, even stepped onto the porch, but there was nothing, not even one bar. Everyone else tried too, with the same result. That's when we tried the Wi-Fi. The router was there, plugged into the wall, but the network didn't show up. The box had lights on, but no matter what we did, we couldn't get any connection. First, we laughed it off. We had come out there to disconnect anyway, and being unreachable almost felt like part of the experience. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that if anything went wrong, we had no way of calling anyone. No backup, no lifeline. As the sun went down, the woods grew darker than I expected. Without streetlights or houses nearby, the only light came from the moon through the trees. The air cooled fast, and the forest around us grew so quiet that every snap of a twig stood out sharp. We lit a fire in the fireplace and tried to settle in for the night. By midnight, everyone had gone to bed. I was still awake, lying under the quilt in one of the small bedrooms. The silence pressed in thick, broken only by the occasional crack from the fire dying down. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, the faint sound of the front door handle moving. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again, clearer. The rattle of metal, slow, deliberate. Someone was trying the handle. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My first thought was that maybe one of my friends had gotten up, maybe to get water or step outside. But then I remembered the way the door had sounded when we came in earlier. It had a heavy latch, and the handle made a distinct metallic noise. This was the same sound, but slower, like someone testing it carefully. The noise stopped for a few seconds. Then came a faint push against the wood, a slight creak as if weight leaned against the door. Whoever it was wasn't just testing the handle, they were checking if it would give. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. I could hear the wind outside, the soft creaks of the cabin, and then again, that slow rattle. The thought that someone was right outside the front door, in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal and no way to call for help, hit me hard. I didn't move. I just listened, waiting. The handle shifted again, one final slow turn, but the lock held. After a while, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse, because I didn't know if whoever it was had walked away or was still standing there in the dark, waiting. I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. Every creak felt like footsteps. When dawn finally came, I got up and checked the door. The lock was still latched, but when I looked closely, I saw faint smudges on the handle. They weren't ours. We had barely touched it after coming in, and now there were fresh streaks of dirt, as if someone had gripped it with a dirty hand. The others thought maybe it was an animal, but animals don't try door handles. Animals scratch or push. This had been deliberate. The rest of the morning, we couldn't shake the unease. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt empty in a way that made you realize how far you were from help. The fact that we had no phone signal became more of a problem than an inconvenience. We debated leaving early. Part of us wanted to pretend it was nothing, to stay and not waste the trip. But every time I looked at that door, I thought about how easy it would have been for someone stronger or more determined to force their way in. I thought about what would have happened if the lock hadn't held. By noon, we were packing. No one argued. We loaded up the car quickly, glancing around the trees as if expecting to see someone watching us. The gravel road felt longer on the way out, every turn making us breathe a little easier as we got closer to town. When we finally had phone service again, I reported the incident to the rental site. I explained that someone had tried the door during the night, that we felt unsafe, that the Wi-Fi listed wasn't even working. They said they'd reach out to the host, but I never found out if they got an explanation. What stayed with me wasn't just the noise at the door. It was the realization that we had been completely cut off. No phones, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors within shouting distance. If that door had opened, there would have been nothing we could do but try to fight or run into the woods. The cabin had looked peaceful when we arrived, like a safe escape from the world. But that night showed me how quickly peace can turn into vulnerability. What seemed like quiet isolation was really just being exposed, with nothing between us and whoever decided to come to that door except one thin lock. I'll never forget lying in that bed, listening to the slow turn of the handle, realizing someone was out there, trying to come in, while we had no way to reach anyone. That helplessness stuck with me more than anything. It taught me that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the dark woods themselves. It's knowing that if danger comes to the door, you're completely on your own.